There are moments in life that change everything. Moments that force you to see people for who they really are. And this was one of those moments. My wedding looked perfect from the outside. Beautiful dress, emotional ceremony, smiling faces everywhere. Everyone kept telling me how lucky I was. But just days later, my mother-in-law said something that completely shattered that illusion. She told me she needed to come with us on our honeymoon. Before I continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel because stories like this don't come from imagination, they come from real life, and they happen more often than we admit. And tell me something in the comments right now. What city are you watching from? I want to know how far this story is traveling. Take a deep breath, because if I hadn't lived through this myself, I'm not sure I would believe it either. There are things in life that only make sense once you've lived through them. Moments so absurd that if someone else told you the story, you would probably raise an eyebrow and quietly think they were exaggerating, even if you tried to be polite about it. This is one of those stories. Not because it is dramatic in the obvious sense, but because it reveals how far certain boundaries can be pushed before you even realize they no longer exist. What happened to me didn't start with shouting or confrontation. It started with smiles, with concern disguised as care, with silence that felt harmless at first. From the outside, my wedding looked exactly like what people expect happiness to look like, the kind of scene that convinces everyone watching that love always wins and that the future is guaranteed simply because two people said, "I do." The dress was perfect, the ceremony was emotional, and the guests were visibly moved. People cried, hugged us, and repeated the same phrase over and over again. "You're so lucky." I smiled every time I heard it, because that's what you're supposed to do. You don't question happiness when everyone else seems certain about it. But even that day, surrounded by applause and warm words, there was a presence that felt heavier than it should have. A presence that occupied more space than the moment allowed. My mother-in-law was everywhere. She wasn't just happy, she was radiant, emotional, deeply involved, as if the wedding were happening to her as much as it was happening to me. She commented on every detail, corrected small things, and stayed close to her son at all times. Too close. Close enough to make me feel like a guest at my own celebration. From the beginning of our relationship, she had always been present, but back then I interpreted it as care, as interest, as the behavior of a loving mother who simply wanted to be involved in her son's life. She knew our schedules, our plans, and sometimes even details I didn't remember sharing. She sent messages every morning and every night. She asked questions that sounded sweet on the surface, and she always spoke with a gentle tone that made it difficult to say no. Control doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives smiling. On the wedding day, that presence became impossible to ignore, especially in the small moments that no one else seemed to notice, but that stayed with me long after the music stopped. She fixed his tie more than once, adjusted his jacket, and corrected the way he stood for the photos. Each gesture was subtle, almost invisible to others, and he allowed it, without hesitation, without discomfort, as if it were natural, as if it had always been that way. There was one moment, brief but unforgettable, when someone asked him a simple question about our plans, and before answering, he instinctively looked at her, not at me. It wasn't intentional, it was automatic. She responded with a small nod, barely noticeable, and only then did he speak. That single exchange lasted seconds, but something shifted inside me, because I realized I wasn't imagining things. I was witnessing a dynamic that existed long before I arrived. Throughout the night, I told myself I was overthinking, that weddings are emotional, that mothers get attached, and that love requires patience. We are taught to doubt our instincts when they feel inconvenient. We label discomfort as insecurity. We silence our questions to avoid ruining the moment. And so I smiled, I laughed, I danced. all while pushing a quiet unease further down, hoping it would disappear on its own. It didn't. When the celebration finally ended and the house grew quiet, I felt an unexpected sense of relief, the kind you feel when a performance is over and you can finally take off the costume. I thought the hardest part was behind us. I thought the honeymoon would be a fresh start, a pause from expectations and opinions, a space where it would finally be just the two of us. No interference, no background noise, just time, distance, and the illusion that everything would settle naturally. I didn't know yet that the real story was just beginning. 2 days later, while I was packing our bags and organizing documents with that nervous excitement that comes before a long-awaited trip, my phone vibrated on the bed beside me. Her name appeared on the screen. The message was short and polite. "Can we talk? It's important." There are messages that don't need exclamation points to feel heavy. This was one of them. I felt my stomach tighten before my mind could react. And in that moment, I already sensed that nothing about this conversation would be small. She arrived with a seriousness that felt rehearsed, moving slowly, choosing her words carefully, as if she had practiced them in advance. She sat on the couch, took a deep breath, and reached for my hand with a softness that should have comforted me, but somehow did the opposite. Excessive tenderness can be a warning. She started by praising the wedding. She said she was happy for us. She spoke about her son, about how sensitive he was, about how attached he had always been, and with every sentence, the room felt smaller. Then she said it, calmly, clearly, without hesitation or humor. She said she needed to come with us on our honeymoon, not as a suggestion, not as a joke, as a decision. I waited for laughter that never came, for a correction that never followed. And in that silence, I realized what shocked me most wasn't the request itself. It was the fact that she expected me to accept it. If this story is already making you uncomfortable, take note of that feeling because it exists for a reason. And later, I want you to tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. Situations like this test not only relationships, but self-respect. And sometimes what we choose not to say in the beginning ends up defining everything that comes after. At that moment, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at my husband, waiting for him to speak. And when he didn't, something inside me quietly broke. Because silence in moments like that is never neutral. After she said it, the room fell into a silence that didn't feel awkward, but calculated. The kind of silence that waits for your agreement rather than your opinion, pressing gently until resistance feels rude. She watched my face closely, as if measuring how long it would take for me to give in. There was no embarrassment in her expression, no hesitation, only expectation. That was when I realized this wasn't a request. It was a plan that simply required my compliance. She continued speaking, calmly explaining her reasons with the confidence of someone who truly believed she was being reasonable, framing everything as concern rather than intrusion. She talked about how sensitive her son was, how changes affected him, how distance made him anxious. Each sentence was delivered softly but carried weight. It wasn't about logistics, it was about guilt, and I could feel it settling slowly on my shoulders. I kept glancing at my husband, waiting for him to interrupt, to laugh it off, or at least to look as uncomfortable as I felt. But he remained quiet, his silence louder than any agreement. At times, he nodded faintly, almost unconsciously. At others, he stared at the floor. He never once said no. And in that moment, I understood something painful. This wasn't new for him. This dynamic was familiar. She reassured me that she wouldn't interfere, repeating that she would stay out of the way and give us space, as if saying it often enough could make it true. She talked about being nearby, not involved, about offering support, not control. Her words were polished and careful, but something about them felt hollow, because boundaries that need to be explained usually already exist. In this one, clearly didn't. I tried to respond calmly, choosing my words carefully, explaining that a honeymoon was meant to be private, that it symbolized the beginning of a life together, a space meant only for two people. I spoke slowly, respectfully. I didn't accuse or attack. I simply stated what felt obvious to me. She listened with her head slightly tilted. the universal gesture of someone who hears but doesn't intend to change their mind. And when I finished, she smiled. She said she understood, and then immediately continued explaining why it still made sense for her to come. She spoke about motherhood, about sacrifice, about sleepless nights and endless worry. Every sentence redirected the focus back to her feelings, back to her fears, back to her needs. And without saying it directly, she placed me in the role of the selfish one for hesitating. What unsettled me the most wasn't her insistence, but how natural all of this seemed to them, as if this arrangement had been silently accepted long ago. I was the only one in the room questioning it, the only one visibly uncomfortable. And that kind of isolation makes you doubt yourself. It makes you wonder if you're missing something obvious, if you're being dramatic, if you're the problem. At one point, she asked if I had thought about it with an open heart, a question that didn't actually invite reflection, only agreement. I took a deep breath and said I needed time to think. It was the most neutral answer I could offer. She didn't like it, but she hid it well. She squeezed my hand gently, said she trusted my judgment, and left confident that the outcome would favor her. After she walked out, the air between us felt heavy, filled with things that should have been said but weren't. I waited for him to say something, anything, an apology, a denial, a reassurance. But all he said was that his mother was worried, as if that explained everything. That was the moment memories I had ignored began resurfacing. Small moments I had brushed aside. Conversations where her opinion always mattered more than mine. Decisions subtly influenced. Plans adjusted to avoid her discomfort. At the time, I called it respect. I called it family closeness. Now I was starting to see it differently. It wasn't closeness, it was dependence, and I had stepped right into it without noticing. That night, I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to his steady breathing while my thoughts raced uncontrollably. I felt alone in a way I hadn't before, not physically but emotionally, as if there was an invisible third presence between us. And the more I thought about the honeymoon, the clearer it became. This wasn't about the trip. It was about boundaries that had never been drawn. In the quiet of the night, I realized I was standing at a crossroads I hadn't expected to face so early. One path leading toward acceptance and silence, the other toward discomfort and confrontation. Neither felt easy, but one felt honest. And honesty, I was learning, often comes with a cost. I didn't know yet what I would do. I didn't have a plan, but something inside me had shifted, and once that happens, there's no going back. If you're listening to this and have ever felt pressured to accept something that didn't sit right with you, remember that discomfort is rarely random, and it often shows up before your mind can fully explain why. I didn't understand everything yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. If I ignored this feeling now, it would only grow louder later, and the price of staying silent would be much higher. That thought followed me into sleep, and it didn't let go. The next morning, I woke up with that strange feeling of having slept without truly resting. My body heavy while my mind seemed to have worked all night replaying the same conversation over and over again. He was still asleep beside me, calm and unbothered, as if nothing unusual had happened. I watched him for a few seconds, trying to understand how it was possible for one moment to feel so life-altering to me and so insignificant to him. That contrast unsettled me deeply. I slipped out of bed quietly. The house felt too silent. Not peaceful, just empty. In the kitchen, I made coffee without thinking, my movements automatic, my thoughts anything but. Every sentence she had spoken the day before returned with more weight than before. Every pause he had left unfilled echoed louder in my head. I realized that what troubled me most wasn't her confidence, it was his acceptance of it. The way nothing about the situation seemed to surprise him, as if this were simply how things worked. As I stood there, staring at the steam rising from my cup, memories I had once dismissed as irrelevant began lining up in my mind. forming a pattern I could no longer ignore. Plans that had quietly changed after phone calls with her. Opinions he once shared with me, only to later reverse. Decisions that were never truly ours. Back then, I called it compromise. I called it maturity. Now, it felt like something else entirely. When he finally joined me, he wrapped his arms around me from behind and asked if I had slept well, the kind of question people ask out of habit rather than concern. I said yes, not because it was true, but because I didn't have the energy to unpack the truth yet. Sometimes silence feels easier than explanation. We sat at the table together, and he began talking about the trip, the flight schedule, the hotel, the plans ahead. He spoke as if everything were settled, as if no line had been crossed, as if nothing needed to be addressed. I asked him carefully whether he genuinely thought it was normal for his mother to come with us on our honeymoon, choosing my tone delicately as possible. He paused before answering. Then he said he understood why I felt uncomfortable, but that she was just worried. He added that it would only be this once. Those 3 words landed heavily, because just this once has a way of becoming permanent, and deep down I knew it. What frightened me wasn't the possibility of her presence, it was the realization that my discomfort was being treated as an inconvenience rather than a warning. He avoided my eyes as he spoke, as if looking at me might force him to acknowledge something he wasn't ready to face. In that moment, I felt invisible, not unheard, unseen, and that kind of loneliness doesn't come from being alone. Throughout the day, I noticed details I might have ignored before, small gestures that suddenly felt significant. The way he answered her calls immediately, no matter what we were doing, the way his tone softened when he spoke to her, the way decisions seemed to align without discussion. It was like watching a familiar routine from the outside for the first time. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Awareness has a way of changing everything. That afternoon, I went for a walk alone, needing air, space, and a moment where no one expected anything from me. The world moved normally around me, people laughing, couples talking, life continuing without hesitation. I watched them and thought about what a honeymoon is supposed to represent. Not a vacation, not a destination, but the beginning of a shared life. And I felt that beginning slipping away. When I returned home, he was on the phone, and I knew immediately who it was, even before he looked at me with that quick, defensive glance. He didn't say her name, but he didn't have to. Some presences don't need introduction. I went to another room and let the conversation finish without interruption. The distance between us felt wider than the walls of the house, and for the first time, I wondered how long that distance had been there. Dinner that night was quiet, filled with polite exchanges and unfinished thoughts, the kind of silence that signals something breaking rather than something resting. Neither of us seemed willing to push the conversation further, not out of peace, but out of exhaustion. I realized then that avoidance can be just as damaging as conflict, sometimes more, because it allows problems to grow unnoticed, and this one was already too big. Standing in front of the mirror later, I barely recognized the woman looking back at me, someone newly married yet already questioning the space she occupied in her own life. I asked myself how far I was willing to bend to keep things comfortable for everyone else, how much of myself I was expected to shrink, and the answer came quietly but clearly. I didn't want to begin my life this way, not confused, not sidelined, not silent. That night, lying awake once more, I understood that I was facing a choice that no one else could make for me, a choice between maintaining appearances and honoring my own boundaries. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was internal, and those are often the hardest decisions of all. I didn't know what I would do yet, but I knew I couldn't pretend everything was fine anymore. If this situation feels familiar to you in any way, I'd really like you to share your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this tend to feel isolating until we realize how common they actually are. Many people face moments where silence becomes heavier than conflict, where staying feels harder than leaving, and simply knowing you're not alone can change how you see everything. That realization was slowly settling in for me. And once it did, it refused to be ignored. Something inside me was waking up. I woke up the next morning with a strange sense of clarity that didn't feel calm or comforting, but sharp and unavoidable, like suddenly seeing a picture come into focus after staring at it blurred for too long. It wasn't peace, it was awareness, the kind that hurts because it removes your excuses. I got out of bed before he woke up and walked into the living room, still in my pajamas, carrying the weight of everything I had been avoiding. The house was silent, but not restful. It felt like it was waiting. I sat on the couch and stared at nothing in particular, realizing how much energy I had spent trying to normalize what didn't feel normal at all. Every corner of that room seemed to hold an unspoken expectation. Be patient, be understanding, don't make things difficult. And for the first time, I felt tired of meeting expectations that cost me my voice. Confusion had slowly transformed into exhaustion, and exhaustion has a way of clarifying things. I picked up my phone and scrolled through old messages without a clear goal, rereading conversations that once seemed harmless but now felt loaded with meaning. Suggestions that always came from the same person. Decisions that somehow never belonged fully to us. Moments when I had felt uncomfortable but chose silence instead of confrontation. It was like assembling a puzzle long after the picture should have been obvious. The pieces had always been there. I just hadn't wanted to see the image they formed. When he finally woke up, he spoke to me as if everything were fine, casually mentioning flight times and travel details with the ease of someone who didn't sense the shift happening beneath the surface. I answered politely, even kindly, but something in me had already pulled away. I was present, but no longer involved. Sometimes detachment happens quietly, long before anyone notices, and once it starts, it's difficult to reverse. I realized I was already standing at a distance. At one point, he asked if something was wrong, and I told him I was just thinking, to which he replied that I always thought too much, a comment that landed harder than he probably intended, because thinking too much is often how people describe women who notice things others prefer to ignore. I didn't argue, I didn't explain, I simply nodded, not because I agreed, but because I was done justifying my awareness. Some realizations don't need permission. As the day went on, I found myself observing everything differently, as if a filter had been removed and I was finally seeing the dynamic clearly. The way his voice softened when she called, the immediate availability, the instinct to explain her behavior instead of questioning it. None of it was new. What was new was my refusal to dismiss it. Once awareness settles in, denial becomes impossible, and that awareness stayed with me all day. When he left the house to take care of errands, I was alone for the first time in days, and the silence felt different without the tension of unspoken conversations hanging in the air. I sat at the table with my laptop open, not entirely sure what I was about to do, only certain that something needed to change. There was no dramatic plan forming in my head, no speech prepared, just a quiet determination that felt unfamiliar but steady. Sometimes decisions don't arrive loudly, they arrive calmly. And that calm can be more powerful than fear. Almost without thinking, I opened the airline's website, my fingers moving before my doubts could catch up, guided more by instinct than logic. I searched for flights, not to our destination, but to a place I had always wanted to visit on my own. A place with no expectations attached to it, no shared plans, no compromises. Each click felt deliberate, even though I hadn't consciously planned it. It wasn't about escape, it was about choice. As I entered my information, my heart raced, not with panic, but with something closer to relief, a sensation I hadn't felt in a long time. This wasn't impulsive in the way people like to label women's decisions. It was cumulative, built from every ignored instinct and swallowed discomfort. When the confirmation screen appeared, I stared at it longer than necessary, waiting for regret to show up. It didn't. What I felt instead was clarity. For a brief moment, doubt tried to return, whispering questions about whether I was overreacting, whether this was too drastic, whether I should try harder to adapt. But then I remembered the silence, his silence, her confidence, and the doubt lost its strength. Because when someone shows you who they are and what they will tolerate, believing them becomes an act of self-respect. I closed the laptop knowing something irreversible had just happened. In that moment, I thought about how many people stay in situations that slowly erode them simply because leaving feels uncomfortable or inconvenient. How often we confuse endurance with love. How easily we convince ourselves that our boundaries are negotiable. This wasn't just my story. It was a familiar pattern playing out again, and recognizing that made the decision feel even more necessary. Some lessons repeat until they are learned. If this story resonates with you in any way, now is a good moment to subscribe to the channel, because what comes next isn't just about one relationship, but about the consequences of choosing yourself when it would be easier not to. Stories like this aren't shared to shock, they're shared to reflect, to remind people that awareness often comes before change, and that change rarely feels comfortable at first. What matters is what happens after, and there was still more ahead. When he came back home later that day, I spoke to him normally, answered questions, even smiled at the right moments, while internally preparing myself for what was coming. I wasn't hiding out of fear, I was gathering strength. That night, I packed a different suitcase, not the one meant for our honeymoon, but one filled with simple clothes and practical choices. There was nothing romantic about it, no fantasy attached, just intention. And intention, I was learning, is powerful. As I lay in bed beside him that night, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, I understood something that felt both heavy and freeing. Some goodbyes don't begin with words, they begin with awareness, with the quiet understanding that staying would require you to disappear, and leaving, no matter how painful, would allow you to remain whole. I didn't cry, I didn't feel dramatic, I felt resolved, and that resolution stayed with me as sleep finally arrived. The day of the trip arrived with an unsettling brightness, sunlight pouring through the window as if the world were celebrating something my heart still hadn't fully caught up with. I got ready slowly, deliberately, moving through each step as if following a quiet ritual rather than preparing for a honeymoon. There was no rush, no visible anxiety. If anything, I felt strangely composed, not because I was certain of what would happen, but because my decision had already settled inside me. And once a decision reaches that place, the body follows. He woke up cheerful, energized by the idea of travel, talking about schedules, lines at the airport, and how this was finally the beginning of our life together. He said it with such ease that it almost made me question myself for a second. Almost. I smiled politely, responding when necessary, letting his excitement exist without interrupting it. Sometimes people need to walk confidently toward something in order to truly see what it is. I already knew, and that knowledge made the morning feel oddly distant. She arrived early, suitcase in hand, perfectly prepared, as if her presence had always been part of the plan and not an intrusion at all. She greeted us warmly, commenting on timing, traffic, and how unpredictable airports can be, moving through the house with the confidence of someone who belonged there unquestioned. There was nothing hesitant about her behavior, no sign that she doubted her place in the situation, and that certainty spoke volumes. It told me this wasn't sudden. It was simply the first time I had chosen to see it clearly. The drive to the airport felt longer than usual. The car filled with her voice as she discussed hotel details, breakfast schedules, and nearby attractions, always using we as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She even mentioned staying in a room close to ours, emphasizing that it would make things easier for everyone. He nodded along, attentive and agreeable. I watched the scenery pass by through the window, focusing on my breathing, grounding myself in the present moment. This was it. There would be no turning back after today. At the airport, everything felt surreal, surrounded by travelers laughing, hugging, and beginning their own journeys, each one unaware of the quiet unraveling happening beside them. The energy of departure filled the space, a mix of anticipation and movement. She commented on how nice it was to travel as a family, smiling as if she were stating an undeniable truth. I noticed the irony, not with anger, but with clarity, because families don't require one person to disappear so another can feel secure, and that realization grounded me even further. We stood together at the check-in counter, documents in hand, her naturally taking charge of his paperwork as she always did, while he allowed it without question. When it was my turn, I handed over my documents calmly, watching the attendant type for a moment before pausing slightly, just long enough for me to notice. She looked at the screen again, then back at me. There was no confusion in her eyes, just confirmation. And in that pause, I felt my heart steady rather than race. I was ready. As we moved toward the boarding area, my thoughts were surprisingly quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a decision has been made and no longer needs debate. She continued speaking enthusiastically about plans and schedules. He listened. I listened too, but differently. I was listening to the end of something, not with bitterness, but with acceptance, because clarity doesn't always arrive with drama. Sometimes it arrives with silence. When the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope I had prepared, my movements unhurried, intentional. I handed it to him and asked him to look at it for a moment, my voice steady, neutral, giving nothing away. He opened it casually at first, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. Then his expression changed. Confusion crossed his face. He looked up at me, then back down at the paper, searching for an explanation. And in that moment, time seemed to slow. He asked why the ticket listed a different destination, his voice uncertain now, as if the ground beneath him had shifted unexpectedly. Before he could say more, she leaned in, alarmed, demanding to know what was going on, her tone sharp for the first time. I took a breath, not to prepare myself, but to stay grounded, because this was the moment everything converged, every ignored instinct, every swallowed word, and I knew exactly what I needed to say. I told them calmly that they were free to travel together, that I had chosen a different destination for myself, one that felt aligned with the life I wanted to begin. He stared at me, disbelief giving way to panic, asking if I was serious. She reacted faster, calling it disrespectful, unnecessary, extreme. I listened without interrupting, because sometimes letting people reveal themselves is the clearest response of all. When I finally spoke again, my voice didn't shake, and that surprised even me. I said that a marriage begins with two people, and when it starts with three, something essential is already lost. He tried to defend her, repeating that she was only worried, only trying to help. I told him that I wasn't attacking her intentions. I was protecting my boundaries. She accused me of exaggerating. I smiled softly, not in mockery, but in acceptance, because limits often look extreme to those who benefit from their absence. I picked up my suitcase slowly, feeling the weight of it in my hand, grounding myself in the physical reality of the moment. He reached out, asking me to talk, to reconsider, to wait. I told him we had already talked, many times, just not in the way he was ready to hear. I stepped back gently, creating space without hostility. No shouting, no scene, just clarity. And then I turned away. Walking toward my gate felt lighter with every step, not because the situation was easy, but because it was honest. There were no tears, no dramatic gestures, no audience, just a quiet choice unfolding in a crowded place. When I sat down and looked out at the planes through the glass, I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but peace. the kind that comes when you stop abandoning yourself. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. After that day, things didn't explode the way people often imagine when they hear a story like this, because real consequences usually arrive quietly, spreading through conversations you're not part of and opinions you didn't ask for. There were no public arguments, no dramatic confrontations, just versions of the story traveling without me. Some said I had abandoned a marriage. Others said I had overreacted. I let them talk. Not every truth needs defending. I boarded the plane alone, and while that image might sound sad to some, it didn't feel that way to me at all, because solitude can be incredibly peaceful when it comes from choice rather than rejection. As the plane took off, I felt my body relax in a way it hadn't in months. No tension in my shoulders, no knot in my stomach, just quiet. And in that quiet, I realized how much noise I had been living with without noticing. Sometimes peace only becomes recognizable after chaos steps away. At the destination I had chosen, no one knew me, my story, or the role I had been expected to play. And that anonymity felt strangely healing. I walked unfamiliar streets, ate when I was hungry, rested when I was tired. There were no schedules to negotiate and no feelings to manage except my own. That simplicity gave me space to breathe. And with every passing day, I felt parts of myself slowly returning. A few days later, messages began arriving, long and emotional, filled with confusion, explanations, and frustration, mostly focused on how difficult I had made things for everyone else. He wrote that I had put him in an impossible position. I read every word carefully, and for the first time, I didn't feel responsible for fixing it, because the impossible position had existed long before I walked away. It just hadn't been acknowledged, and now it was his to face. She wrote too, but her messages carried accusation rather than reflection, blaming me for breaking a family and disrupting what she saw as stability. I didn't respond, not out of spite, but because explanations are useless when someone is more interested in control than understanding. People who are used to being centered often feel attacked when they're no longer prioritized. That realization brought clarity rather than anger, and clarity changes how much power words have over you. When I eventually returned home, the conversations that followed were difficult, layered with emotion, regret, and realizations that came too late to undo what had already happened. He said he had never noticed how much his mother interfered. I listened, but noticing something after it has caused damage doesn't erase the impact. Awareness matters. Timing matters too, and some lessons only arrive when something is lost. The separation that followed wasn't easy, nor was it something I took lightly, because choosing yourself often means letting go of a version of life you once believed in. I didn't leave because I didn't care. I left because caring without boundaries was costing me too much. Love that requires you to disappear isn't love, it's endurance. And endurance is not a foundation for a shared life. That truth settled slowly but firmly. People asked if I regretted it, if I wished I had tried harder, stayed quieter, compromised more, and every time I heard those questions, I thought about what trying harder would have actually meant. Teaching someone to choose me, convincing someone to set boundaries, explaining my worth repeatedly. Those aren't things you can force. They're choices others have to make on their own. And realizing that freed me from guilt. When I think back to the airport now, I don't feel embarrassment or anger, but gratitude for the discomfort that pushed me to act before I lost myself completely. Discomfort is often treated as something to avoid, but it's also a signal, a warning that something no longer fits. Ignoring it comes at a cost that grows over time. I almost paid that price, and I'm grateful I didn't. If you're listening to this and have ever felt pressured into accepting something that didn't sit right with you, I'd really like you to share in the comments what you would have done in my place, because these conversations help others recognize patterns they might still be questioning. Stories feel less isolating when they're shared, And sometimes reading one honest comment can be enough to give someone clarity. Your voice matters more than you think, and this space exists for that exchange. No judgment, just reflection. If you know someone who might need to hear this story, someone who's struggling to set boundaries or questioning their instincts, consider sharing this video with them, because sometimes courage is contagious when it's seen rather than preached. Leaving isn't always failure. Sometimes it's self-preservation, sometimes it's growth, and sometimes it's the beginning of a life that finally feels like your own. That perspective deserves space, and it deserves to be heard. Today, I understand that the honeymoon was never really about the trip itself, but about what I was willing to accept at the very start of a shared life. In that airport, I didn't just change destinations, I changed direction. I chose not to compete for space in my own relationship. I chose not to shrink to keep others comfortable. And that choice reshaped everything that came after, quietly, decisively. Life moved on, as it always does, with ordinary days, unexpected challenges, and moments of reflection. But it moved on with me at the center of my own decisions, no longer negotiating my place in the room. I didn't need permission to exist fully. I didn't need approval to feel whole. And that realization brought a freedom I hadn't known before. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and deeply mine. If you stayed until the end, thank you for listening, because these stories aren't shared just to entertain, but to reflect experiences many people live through silently. They hold mirrors, not instructions, and sometimes seeing your own situation reflected back can be unsettling, but also empowering. If this story made you think, feel, or question something, then it did what it needed to do. And if you haven't yet, this is a great moment to subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories like this waiting to be told. Because in the end, this was never only about a mother-in-law, a marriage, or a honeymoon. It was about choice, about the courage to choose yourself when it would be easier to stay quiet. That choice isn't simple. It isn't celebrated by everyone, but it is the one that allows you to keep your voice, your space, and your sense of self. And that, more than anything else, is what makes it worth it.